7:01 it is, so time to get started. As I said before, welcome on in everyone to Ivy Experience's Junior Summit. This is one of my personal favorite events of the year because essentially what we're going to do is set the table for all of the steps between March 9th of junior year through submission of college applications, everything you need to know about the various factors that come into play. My name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director of Ivy Experience. My main role is to oversee our tutoring and test preparation. And I also speak with all of our new families about, most of our services in most cases. So looking at our list of attendees, I know I've spoken on the phone with most of you. So hello, this is what I look like if you've never been to one of our webinars before. I'm joined by Alyssa Coltrane. She's our Assistant Director of College Admissions and one of our fearless essay and application coaches. So is Cate McLaughlin, our Director of College Admissions. These two work directly with students on their college applications and essays to get them across the finish line. So with all that by way of introduction, we'll jump into our first topic of the night, which is really a sort of broader philosophical point about college admissions. So in the college admissions process, there's a whole lot that goes into an individual college's decision whether to admit an individual student. And there are plenty of factors involved in that decision that are outside of your control. Things like your zip code, your demographic information, what other students at your high school are doing. All of these things do come into play and play a role in college admissions. However, our belief is that when it comes to your admissions in the end, there are 6 things you can actually control. So when we're talking about investing your family's time and energy and money into any piece of this process to actually improve your outcomes, it should always be focused on these 6 things. And this is sort of how we've organized tonight's information. So what those 6 things are, your grades and rigor, in other words, what it says on your high school transcript, standardized tests, especially the SAT and ACT, but also other standardized testing like AP exams, which are coming up soon. Letters of recommendation from teachers, which, you might say they're not directly in a student's control, but a student controls the relationships that they build that lead to these letters. Extracurricular activities, of course, and then the written components of the application. The final factor here, we used to always say there are 5 factors in a student's control, and really there are 5 factors that will determine whether an individual college admits a student that are in their control. But when you think about broadly the factors that are in your control in this process, at the end of the day, which colleges you choose to apply to is going to have a very large impact on which you're accepted to in the end. So these are the 6 things where all of your mental energy and attention and stress should go throughout this process to actually yield a positive result.
So we start with grades and rigor because they are the most important of the 6 factors. As Jim will talk to you a little bit later on, there are many colleges to which you can apply test optional at this point. As far as we are aware, there is no college to which you can apply grade optional. So your GPA, class rank, if your school calculates it, but also the courses that your student chooses to take add up to this component of grades and rigor. Are they challenging themselves in their courses? Are they doing well in their courses? Most of the families here tonight have students in their junior year, which is going to be the most important year of their high school career. This is the moment where they are most like the person and intellectual who is going to be applying to a college and eventually attending classes on a college campus. So that is the year that colleges look at most intently in order to determine this component. That being said, the start of senior year does matter too, but junior year will be the year that colleges are able to see almost in its entirety. As far as that component goes, students are 2/3 of the way through their junior year. This is really the moment to take stock. Where are you doing well? Where could you be doing better? And to start thinking about finals and AP exams now. Although those aren't happening until May for AP exams, perhaps even June for finals, because these exams end up being cumulative, this is the moment to start studying a bit every day. Identify strengths and weaknesses by creating material, whether that's practice tests or teaching, others in a study group, and synthesizing that information now. If you find that you're struggling with something, now is the moment to reach out to teachers for assistance, or to consider forming a study group for that AP test, for that final exam, so that the student is really able to sort of build on what they've had, address the weaknesses before the actual final itself. And I know, Jim, that's something that you'll be talking about a little bit more next week, right? In the AP webinar?
That's right. So next week, little sneak preview, we'll be doing a webinar on AP exams and how to prepare for them, what they mean, kind of how colleges view them. Tonight's focus is a little more broad than that, so we're not going to be digging too much into AP exams, because in the broad sweep of college admissions, they're a small piece of the puzzle. But if you're looking for more information on that, how they're viewed by colleges and admissions and credit and placement, and how to prepare well for them, then tune into next week's webinar. The registration link was in the same emails that contain this junior seminar web registration link. So yeah, you can go ahead and register there. So as Alyssa said, the first thing students should do to try to get ready for these big end of year tests is reach out to the resources they have ready. Teachers at school, can they form a peer study group that's going to be really effective? Those are sort of your first line of defense. If for some reason those aren't enough, that's when tutoring can make sense. So when we tutor students for big end of year exams, there are a few things that go into it. Of course, reviewing the actual content and making sure that students are confident with it is going to be the core of that. But a big thing that we focus on with our students is study skills, forming good habits, and building a study plan for their finals. So that, even if a student is working with us on, say, AP chemistry, that tutor can still work with the student to sort of plan out the rest of their studying to make sure that they're being able to balance all of their competing demands in that spring of junior year time that we all know can be very stressful and very demanding on students. So in addition to study skills, content review, our tutors are also coaching students through test-taking strategies. This is especially true for AP exams, where you're dealing with a multiple choice format and free response questions that are in a very specific format, where it's expected that your answer is in a very specific format and hits very specific points. All of our tutors on our team are expert test prep tutors, and then they tutor academic subjects according to their background. So they're also experts in the AP exams of those subjects. This kind of test-taking strategy focus can be really valuable too. Many teachers will give practice finals out to students. And so it's a previous year's version of the final exam so that students know what to expect. They can do that final exam as a way to review and see kind of what they're focusing on. And so our tutors can help them with the format in addition to the content. In AP exams especially, there's this nuanced balance of finding a student's, what do they need for form versus what do they need for content. But I would say either way, starting sooner is going to make more sense if you decide that tutoring is the way to go. And that's because, typically cramming for a cumulative exam like an AP exam is not going to pay off. There are certain things we can do in the short term, but if a student's been struggling throughout the year, then tutoring for a few weeks before the exam is really a band-aid for a bullet wound, so to speak. So it can make sense to start earlier. Now, that doesn't mean keeping a super high frequency of tutoring sessions throughout, but you can always subtract tutoring sessions away. You can't add more time in if you start too late. So, and this goes for whether you're working with a tutor or not, starting getting ready for these end of year exams earlier is going to make sense, because again, you can always decrease that frequency, but you can't create time. I should also mention, as I see our first question come in the Q&A, please do drop questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation. We plan to stick around for Q&A at the end of the session here. If there's anything that comes up during the presentation, that's maybe a point we missed and we want to address it right away, we will. Our first question was if we have tutors for the computer science AP exam, and yes, we do, is the answer to that. Now I want to move on to the second factor in a student's control, which is standardized testing in general. And AP exams are a good segue to this. But when we're talking about standardized testing for college admissions, we're mainly talking about the SAT and ACT. So we'll keep this section brief because I know a lot of the people here already have their plans in place for SAT and ACT prep. But I'd like to just talk about it broadly and philosophically so that people can understand, what it means to submit a test score in our current world where so many schools are test optional, et cetera. So it helps to kind of zoom out and talk about what is the point of standardized testing in college admissions? Why did colleges ever require it? Why do they still use it when students do choose to submit it? The number one reason is that standardized tests are very, very good at predicting a student's success in college. Colleges track 3 metrics that are very highly correlated with a student's SAT or ACT scores. That is freshman year GPA, retention rate, meaning a student not transferring away, and graduation rate. And so colleges want to have high numbers for all of these things. Freshman year GPA means students land on campus and they're successful right away. Retention rate means that students are staying and paying tuition and then donating as alumni to that university. And 4-year graduation rate is a big factor in the US News and World Report rankings. And so colleges are incentivized to get their students through in 4 years. So it's true that standardized test scores help colleges predict this. The only factor that is more predictive than standardized test scores for these 3 metrics is high school GPA. Other than that, there's no other one thing you can look at that is more reliable than an SAT or ACT score. And actually, SAT and ACT score and high school GPA are weaker separate than they are together in terms of their predictive power for these colleges. So that's reason number one. Another thing that standardized test scores allow is for a college to compare a student with their local context. When a student applies to a college, they are the guidance office at that college, the counseling office sends a school report with the student's transcript. That school report includes various information about the school, what AP courses are offered, the percentage of students from that school who will attend a 4-year college or university. It will include average scores on the SAT and or ACT. And so colleges can see not just what did this student score, but how does that compare with where they came from in the environment that they were going to school in. Finally, this is part of a holistic review process. And what does that mean? It means that standardized test scores are not the end-all be-all. And frankly, they never have been. They never were before test optional. Standardized test scores are one data point as part of a review process in which colleges are looking at, among other things, those 5 factors that we showed on the first slide. So it's important to remember that, standardized test scores are a piece of the puzzle. They are not the puzzle. All right, so the next thing to talk about, and parents who have already made the decision and students who have already made the decision between SAT and ACT, bear with me, I'll keep it brief. But essentially, colleges accept scores equally from the SAT and the ACT. So students have the option to take either one. Now, in general, the tests are very, very similar. One big difference you'll notice right away is that the ACT has a science section. However, the ACT science section tests a student's ability to read graphs and charts and visual data. The SAT also tests that in all 4 sections of the test. So it's not like you can escape the skills of ACT science by taking the SAT. The biggest difference between the two, if you just look at the number of questions and minutes here, you'll notice, let's just take a look at the reading sections, right? The SAT gives you more minutes than questions. That means you have more than 1 minute per question. The ACT gives you more questions than minutes. That means you have less than 1 minute per question. And in general, the ACT is a much faster paced exam. Students need to do more in less time. The trade-off there is that the SAT is a more complex exam, meaning that the reading level of the passages is going to be higher, the complexity of the questions is going to be greater. The trade-off is they give you more time to work through that increased complexity. So in general, that is the biggest difference between the 2 tests. It's true that there's a section of the SAT where you can't use a calculator. There are a bunch of small differences in terms of question types that show up more or less frequently on one or the other exam, but the timing we tend to find is the biggest difference. So just to illustrate my point about ACT Science, one of these two questions is from ACT Science and the other is from SAT Reading. If I didn't tell you, or if you weren't a psycho like me and could just tell from the font differences which one was the SAT or ACT, then you would have no idea which one was from a science test and which one was from a reading test. The SAT question is on the left. Students might recognize the black and gray border that College Board puts around the questions for the SAT. This is an ACT Science question. This is an SAT Reading question. So again, you're not escaping ACT Science by not taking the ACT. So if I'm saying that the tests are quite similar, how do you decide which one to take? Try both and compare how you do on them. For some students, they're going to score far stronger on one or the other. They're going to have a clear favorite test. It's going to show in the scores, and it's just obvious which one they should be pursuing from there. For other students, if the scores are similar, then we'll take a look at where the strengths and weaknesses are on each test and figure out which one is likely to yield better results in the long run. So we offer diagnostic testing for the test so that students can take a version of both. We'll compare the scores. If they've already taken an SAT, they can just do our ACT diagnostic or vice versa. Once you have a benchmark score for each, we can take a look at that and recommend a test. And of course, there's no charge for that with us. The only thing you're ever paying for from a test prep standpoint is time spent with the tutor. So when to take the tests? These are the full school year of test dates from today. Now, of course, it's too late to register for the March SAT, which is on Saturday. But these are the test dates that remain throughout the school year. The bolded dates that I have for both SAT and ACT are the final dates that are accepted for early action and early decision deadlines at most colleges. So early action and early decision deadlines tend to be mid-October through mid-November. And so the September ACT and October SAT are going to be the last dates that students can take if they're submitting for those deadlines. Most of our students will end up applying to at least one school with an early deadline, which is why it's so important to remember this. You can take the test through December for a college's regular deadline. They're typically around New Year's. So now let's talk about test optional. So one important thing to remember about test optional is that it's nothing new. I mean, Bates College has been test optional since the 80s. And now it used to be exclusive to small liberal arts schools. Nowadays, small liberal arts schools, I think, are still some of the strongest proponents of test optional admissions, but most colleges are test optional. There are a few colleges that are test blind. They won't accept scores at all. That would be the University of California and California state systems. Those colleges are not interested in seeing your SAT or ACT score at all. You can still send them AP scores though. Then you have a few schools that require scores. So the Florida State University system and the University of Tennessee would be examples of that, MIT and a few others. So you'll see a few schools on either end that either don't use scores at all or require scores from all applicants. And then most colleges are somewhere in the middle where they're saying that they're test optional. It is still true that the best way to apply to a college, and by best, I mean your highest chances of success, are with a test score that college is happy to see. So you're able to essentially look up a college's median and, middle 50%. A college will publish their 25th percentile and 75th percentile test score. You want to be at least in that range, if not above that median, the 50th percentile. If you're ever wondering about whether or not to submit your score, I'm always happy to talk through that decision with any family who's worked with us on test prep or really any service. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you're interested in having that conversation for your student. But the point is, if you don't do well on these tests, if these tests are just not a good reflection of your student's, ability, if they're a straight A student taking a super, difficult load of AP courses and doing really well in them, but for some reason their test score is just not reflecting that same level of ability, they do not have to submit a test score and lessen their application with it. So that's really why test optional exists. It's there to be able to essentially not submit a score that would hurt you. That doesn't mean that a good score is not going to help you. And one thing that's important to remember, colleges will post on their websites that the language they all love to use is, you will not hurt your application by not submitting a test score. Now, it's important to remember that you don't lose a basketball game because the ref took points from you. You lose a basketball game because the other team scored more points than you. Now, at the end of the day, college admissions is a competition. Some students are going to get in at the expense of other students not getting into those same spots. So you do ideally want to try to get that score that's going to be an asset. Again, it's about the time and energy and money and stress that you would put into getting that score. Is it worth the investment, or should you be focusing on other areas of your application profile? So how do we help with test scores? We meet students where they are, and that means essentially that we're doing targeted sessions on the areas where students are missing questions on assignments that are from real practice tests. So we use real practice tests and segments of practice tests to identify students' areas of need. And then parents are constantly updated by the tutor on their students' progress throughout the time they're working with us. I can go into more detail for a specific student. If you want to talk through a test prep plan, please set up a call with me after this. But essentially, we're finding students where they are and helping them improve in the areas that are going to get them the most points on future tests. Okay, so I mentioned that, sometimes it's not worth dumping all of your time and energy and money and stress into test prep because so many other factors are significant. So now I'll turn it over so that you can learn a little bit more about what those other factors might be.
Thanks, Jim. Hey, everybody, I'm Cate. As Jim said, I'm the director of college admissions. Please forgive me, I'm a little bit snuffly, so if I'm sniffling throughout this, it's not you, it's me. I'm very happy to be here. So I like talking about letters of recommendation because they're one, my background is as a teacher, so I have some feelings about it. And two, secondly, it's one of those things that kids think is, falls under the thing that is not under their control because someone else is writing the letter, to which I say, nonsense, it's entirely under your control to a certain extent. So let's start with why they're important. So recommendation letters, they speak to things that, in my world, I'd sort of call soft skills, right? The other parts of your application, your essays, your activity section, the additional information, those are going to expand on all the neat things you've done, all the stuff that is essentially your resume highlights, right? What I like about a letter of recommendation and why they're important is they speak to things that don't necessarily come across in your activity listing that you did the school newspaper. It might not talk about your determination or your compassion or your empathy, things that seeing how you communicate in a classroom, seeing what you bring, asking for help, who you are in a community. That's the kind of thing you want to get across in a letter of recommendation. And it's invaluable for admissions officers to get that third-party perspective, right? And I think how you build relationships with the teachers you're going to ask is something I'll talk about in a minute, but it's the most important piece and a big piece of what's under your control. So the question of who you should ask. So you're typically going to have, now this is it causes students a lot of undue stress. I'm going to say the simplest kind of rules are 2 teachers make a main subjects, and by main subjects, I mean math and English and a science class, right? Main subjects and or subjects that connect to what you want to study. So for example, if you're applying for engineering, you really, really, really want to have a recommendation from a math teacher you had, for example. Ideally, a math teacher you had junior year, and in an even more ideal world, maybe a math teacher you've had twice, right? So think about that. They're looking for core subjects. They're looking for teachers you have an actual relationship with, and they want to know about who you're going to be. They want to see you especially be in line with your academic topics, right? That's not to say if you're an engineering student, you can't have a math teacher and an English teacher. That could be great. Show that you have both sides, but you want to get that math one in there. And this is, going to be very personal, student to student. So this is something that Alyssa and I are talking to kids about all the time. For instance, there's opportunities to use a language teacher. If you're going to go and study Spanish as a minor, that could make sense. But most of the time we'd say, oh, you want to go main subjects. So time to time, it's different. And in fact, I think, don't you have an interesting story, Jim, about you had a third extra recommender, right? We generally tell kids, just for the background, not to add in that third recommendation unless to add something different to your application. You don't need another person saying how wonderful you are, even though it sounds like it would be nice. You should only be thinking about it if it adds something to your app that wouldn't be expressed in the other two. And I think, Jim, you are a perfect example of this.
Yeah. So, and I think when Cate was mentioning the core subjects, she left out my favorite one, which is social studies.
Oh, how could I? You're right. You're right. How
Math,
could I?
English, science, and social studies are going to be
Right.
considered core subjects, and language if it's something you're going to pursue in college.
Right.
So when I was in high school, I was a track and field athlete, and I was just a late bloomer physically, but I was a 3-season track and field athlete, you know, cross country, winter track, spring track. And I was JV all the way through my junior year. Senior year, I was captain of the team. Unfortunately, when you're captain of a spring sport as a senior, it doesn't count for college, right? But I had already, by junior year, grown into a leadership position on the team. I wasn't scoring points because I just wasn't physically the best athlete, but I was in a mentoring role for a lot of the younger students. I was trusted by the coaches to help with equipment setup and things like that. And it was where a lot of my time and focus went in high school. But on a college application, it just said JV, JV, JV. Doesn't look very impressive. Now, my head track and field coach was also my freshman year social studies teacher. And so he knew me in and outside of the classroom. Now, normally you're not going to use a letter of recommendation from a coach. Normally, you're not going to use a letter of recommendation from a freshman year teacher. But in this case, because my sort of defining extracurricular activity looked so unimpressive on paper, despite the fact that, you know, I had made really valuable contributions, at least I thought, to that team. They just weren't in terms of being fast or good at it necessarily. I asked that coach to write me a third letter of recommendation, which he was happy to do, and it worked out very well for me. So that doesn't mean you should always ask a coach, but if you have a special relationship with someone where it could make that kind of sense, and it's a big piece of sort of making your broader profile package in a way that is sensible and, you know, good for colleges to see, then it can make sense to add that third letter.
Yeah. And my last piece is just like, but most of the time it won't. Most of the time you're going to want to, but most of the time admissions officers do not want to read anything beyond what they already have to read. So we talk to kids about this all the time. We'd love to talk to you about it if you have questions, but it's just a good spot. So it's times when it makes sense and times when it doesn't. Which brings us to the next question, which is, when should you be asking? So kind of now is a little early, but we always say before the end of junior year. And what I mean by that is, like, when I say now is a good time to start putting yourself on the radar. So again, I'm going to give you my, you know, we pride ourselves on being straight shooters around here. And I'm in that philosophy. It is brutal to get a lot of recommendation requests as a teacher, even and especially if you love the kid. It's brutal because you have to come up with something new and exciting to say and meaningful. There's pressure. And then you've got 30, 40 more to write sometimes, depending on the size of the school after that, right? So my point is making sure that you are asking early and being the like kid who the teacher says, oh, right, recommendations are coming, versus walking up to the teacher and before you even get to the front of the classroom, they're thinking, oh God, another one. It's way better to be on the earlier side. So right now, you don't have to ask right now. You can wait till after spring break. But I think sort of spring break is a good line of, like, around spring break, you should know who you're going to ask, and you can be using this time to build those relationships. But definitely they're probably not going to write the actual things until over the summer. But again, give them the big heads up, be at the top of the pile and not at the bottom of the pile. If you haven't heard back from them, it's not uncommon for things like this to get a little lost in the beginning and the hustle of senior year, right? Teachers are coming back just like students are. It's a little chaotic. It's so okay to follow up and send them a polite reminder. Ultimately, this is a good thing to know. You can submit your application before they have sent those in. It's going to be on their side. So like if I'm applying to Pitt rolling admission, I can go ahead and put that application in. It might be 2 more months before my teacher's recommendations get in, but that's okay. So it's not going to stop your application, but you just need to make sure it's coming. So, you know, the last piece of this, and this is to me the most important part, is how do we talk about who to ask and how do you ask, right? So there's there might be some parents in here who are old school and believe in thank you notes. I was like very much raised in like a thank you note school of thought. I like the idea. Think of this as a thank you note, a sort of pre-thank you note. If you should ask in person, you should ask a teacher that you have a relationship with. And that's why I say this is something under your control. You should be building those relationships right now. And I don't mean schmooze for the sake of schmoozing. Teachers can see right through that, just like admissions officers can see right through that, right? We all have good sort of BS detectors. Don't schmooze for the sake of schmoozing, but asking for help when you need it. If you're genuinely interested in the subject they're teaching, asking for hey, is there a book you'd recommend I'd read? Hey, is there anything else I can do? Do you need help with the sophomore class chemistry project? That kind of thing. Stopping by office hours, make yourself known. Again, not in a creepy, I'm just trying to put my face in front of you and I have no reason to take up your time and space kind of way, but in a genuine, how can we help each other? What else can I learn? What do I appreciate about this class kind of way? So let's say you've put in the work, you've been raising your you've been raising your hand in class, you get your projects in on time, you go to those office hours, you have a good relationship. The way to ask is in person. Hey, Mr. So-and-so, Ms. So-and-so, Professor such and such, would you be willing to write me a recommendation? Hopefully they're going to say yes. If they hedge at all, they are not a person you want writing your application, your recommendation for your application, right? There's an expression, to damn with faint praise. If there's someone who's like, yeah, sure, maybe, if you don't have anyone else you can ask me, that's not a person that you want to ask. You want to ask someone who loves you and is going to put the effort in. So I'd like to have you ask in person and then send a follow-up email. In that follow-up email, you can either attach a brag sheet, which is just a summary of like, hey, here's all the cool things I did, my resume, my, science fair project, the fact that I'm working on this Eagle Scout thing coming up next year, all that kind of stuff. And, or you can do what I like to do, which is write a note, almost like a thank you note. Dear so-and-so, thank you so much for going to write my recommendation letter. And then pivot into, one thing I really loved about your class was when we studied, when we studied how districts are created, how voting districts are created. That's fascinating to me because it applies to this, and this. And I loved the project I did on, X and Y. And what you're doing there is you're complimenting them and saying, hey, this is something that was meaningful to me, but you're also showing your interest and reminding them what you did. Even somebody who loves you is going to have other students and might have a really hard time remembering the tiny details. So even though it can feel super uncomfortable, and if you're a student watching this and you're squirming a little, I'm so that person too. It is hard to ask for help and to brag about yourself and to try to sell yourself in this way. Write a genuine note that will keep the kind of gross factor out and have the bonus ability of helping your recommender write you an altogether much stronger, much more detailed, much more personal recommendation letter. And we talk to our students about this on essays. There's even like a little research sheet on how to do it. But that's my pitch. Start schmoozing meaningfully now, ask by after spring break, be first in line, and then write a lovely follow-up thank you note that kind of reminds them why you're cool and what you've been working on and what you've done with them over time, especially if you've had them multiple years. So that's my recommendation pitch. So, okay, so we talked about grades and rigor, we talked about test scores, we talked about recommendation letters. One of the last few things we can talk about is extracurricular activities and how they apply in terms of your application. So the thing is, why are they important? They want to see that, there's a lot of hours in a day. They want to see what you're doing with your free time beyond the classroom. How do you pursue your interests? What are you like? How do you give back to the community you're in? What kind of teams or clubs or relationships are you creating outside of the classroom? And it's important because on a college campus, you're not just going to be, a figure in a classroom. You're going to be a whole figure in a dorm, on campus, in the clubs, right? In everything there. So they want to learn who you'll be in a community. And talking about your extracurriculars can give you a great way to kind of demonstrate that. So on the Common Application, which is the app that almost everybody's going to fill out, you've got 10 slots. You should use as many of them as you can. That's not to say panic if you don't have 10 things. Don't. Realistically, if you don't have 10 things, that's totally fine. But make sure you're asking yourself, do things like, hey, I babysit my younger sibling, 12 hours a week. That counts. That's a family responsibility. if you bake, anything you kind of do more than once a week, you teach yourself guitar, you're really into baking, you know, any of those things, you compete in esports, those are all activities I can count. Don't forget, it's not just the school sanctioned clubs, research projects, self-study, all those kinds of things super count. Make sure you can give yourself credit for them and list them in order of how important they are to you. So we're only going to touch sort of briefly on extracurricular activities, but you know, the question of what students should do, if you're here in the junior summit, hopefully you've put in most of the work already for your extracurriculars by now. You kind of have started to figure out this year, what's your jam, what you like. In a perfect world, maybe you've stuck with something for a little while. So maybe you're approaching a leadership position in your junior or senior year. That could be really cool. It's okay to choose things now that are different from what you've done before. It's junior year. You don't have to be locked in, but make sure it sort of aligns with the other things you want to do, right? Admissions officers are keeping their eyes out for people who sort of make sense, right? So make sure that if you're going to drop track and add, you know, yearbook, that connects to, oh, I got really into my journalism class and I'm going to relate that to something else I did, right? In a perfect world. So at the end of the day, this is the big thing. Really do what you care about doing. It sounds crazy. I think kids are, you know, students feel a lot of pressure to do, hey, I raised this much money, I'm in this kind of service clubs, I did this, this, and this, I did 100 different things. Actually, you just need to do what you actually care about. If you want to stand out, go all in on the things you actually care about. You know, we always say better person, better applicant, and it sort of sounds like a line, but the truth is the more you engage in the stuff that actually fascinates you or find ways to expand on those things, like if you love esports and you're thinking, oh, I want to do something for my community, what's a cause you care about? Maybe you care about Ukraine, do an esports tournament and send the money to a Ukraine foundation, right? Like, how can you take the thing you actually already love to do and build out on it and add depth to it? That's always going to look better on an application than, hey, I did 15 different things that are not related to each other and don't build in depth in any way. So they'll be reflected. Some activity essays are a big thing, right? It's a why college essay is very common. Why this college, why this major? And another common essay prompt is please talk about an activity that was especially meaningful to you. So you can be, as you're kind of putting together your college app, that's one of the things you want to be thinking about. What's an activity that you feel like really helps you shine, brought out your best self, your leadership self, your intellectual self, whatever that means to you. So it's okay to discover your interests late. But if you're found, like if this year is the year you fell in love with astronomy because you saw the Weber, you know, photos from the telescope and it blew you away, and then all of a sudden you're a crazy star nut, that's great. Maybe use this summer to map your backyard stars or start a stargazing club or do something, right? That's what I mean by make sense. It's okay to find new things, but try to make some consistency and build depth where you can. And I think this is all you, Alyssa, right? So that's the end of activities and recommendations. I'm going to leave Alyssa for this next big factor of what will impact, which is building your college list. Take it away, my friend.
Yes, so we're taking a little bit of a step back to talk about building your college list. We're going to leave your college essays for last because Cate and I, as essay coaches, lobbied very hard to save the best for last. So let's talk a little bit about the college list. Starting with a fact, there are thousands of colleges. There are, as of 2020, actually, which is the last time the Department of Education counted this, there are 3,982 four-year degree granting colleges in the United States. Even if you are to limit yourself by major, you are not applying to 1,000 colleges. Please don't do that to us, to yourself, to anyone. You're going to have to limit your list somehow. For many of our families, these are conversations we have as we are working on essays and applications. For students who are having trouble sort of pinning down, you know, where I can even start looking, we have a college list service. But one of the most important bits of advice that we give to students is that it's okay to be superficial in some ways. You're not just picking a place where you're going to study biology. And even if that was the case, that's hardly a limiting factor. Most of those 3,982 degree granting institutions are going to have biology, I promise. You're picking a place that's going to be your home for the next 4 years. So think about the weather. Think about, like our co-founder did, do I want to be in a city with a major sports team? We spoke to a student a couple years back who went, I am not applying to a college that doesn't have a Starbucks within 2 blocks because I'm just not going to survive for 2 semesters. I was concerned about distance. I wanted to be close enough that I could go home and visit my family on the weekends when I wanted to, but I also wanted them to not be able to show up without calling me. Sorry, mom and dad. All of these things are going to matter. And as you think through them, that allows you to essentially determine what schools are going to be a match for you. And when we think about match and fit, Jim, do you want to give me the next slide, please? We're thinking about a fit in 4 different ways. All jokes aside about distance and cities and the location of Starbucks, in many ways, that is going to be a physical fit. Is this a school in the right location with the sort of physical elements that you need to be ordered in order to survive and thrive? Academically, does it have the majors that you want? We joked about biology not being a limiting factor, but there are majors that are very specific. Is this a school where you are going to be challenged but not overwhelmed academically? Socially, if you can't wait to go to a school and go to college football games and paint your face and jump around, my alma mater is not the school for you. It is a tiny school in the middle of nowhere, but it was a fit for a lot of students, for me, but not for others. And the final aspect is to consider is financial. A 4-year college or university is a big investment. Thinking through those options can be important. Likely schools may have merit scholarships. State schools offer in-state tuition. One of the things that we would recommend is always checking out the net price calculator for a given school, as especially this can happen with private schools. There is a massive price tag and then substantial discounting because of either merit scholarships or aid. So those are the things that you consider as you start to put together something that we call a mission statement when we have those conversations with our students about pinning down the elements of their college list. And Cate, I think you had a really great story about your mission statement while you were thinking through the college search.
Oh, I mean, I don't, great is overrated, but it is cheese.
Tell us
based,
about
and
the
all good
grilled
stories-
cheese.
I was gonna say all good stories are cheese based. Yeah. So I mean, we talk about mission statements. I love this. You know, I'm like a NASA nerd, so I love the idea of calling it a mission. It's okay not to know what you want to study, right? But trying to figure out what you want out of a college experience, including what you want to study, even if it's just, I know I want to be somewhere flexible because I don't know where I want to study, and I know I like to ski, so it's got to be in the mountains, right? Even those limiting factors can help you put together your mission statement. My big example that I use all the time is like, I was a theater nerd. I was a backstage theater nerd, like stage manager, dramaturgy, directing. That was my thing. And it was really important to me. Like the best part of that whole my high school experience was sitting at this terrible Bickford's diner and eating, potatoes after, after a show went up at midnight with my crew, right? And I absolutely loved that. And when I went to UMass Amherst and toured there, I thought there's no way I'm going to fit at this school. It was a good financial fit for me because I had test scores that would make it very cheap for me to apply. And it was an in-state school for me. I'm from Massachusetts, but I thought, man, the school is giant. I'm never going to survive here. And then as soon as I toured the theater department, it became clear to me, like, they were so warm, so funny. I talked to so many students. I saw students working closely with the faculty. And then and I was completely in love. And then to top it all off, when I was leaving town, there's the Route 9 Diner in Amherst. If any of you have ever, been in the Valley, you'd know the Route 9 Diner. And they had the best grilled cheese and bacon and a milkshake. It was so cheap. It was like $6. It's an all-night diner. And I was like, this is it. This is where I need to be. A big school that will let me study a ton of things, because I know theater's not practical, but I want to do it. But still a super tight department. And then a killer grilled cheese where I could actually picture myself going after the show at 1 a.m. to wind down. Right. So that sounds like a silly, superficial thing, but I was right. That was very much, I spent many a night at the Route 9 Diner, and it was a fantastic experience for me, even though on paper, it would have been maybe my last pick.
All right, so you have a college list, you've got your test score, you're on top of your classes, your GPA is doing well, you've got a good extracurricular activity. You're still not done yet. We have saved the best for last, which is the college essays. So the first thing we want to do is talk about when you're going to write your essays, because there is no good time to write college essays. You are always going to have something else going on. There is only the least worst time to work on your college essays, because in a sense, the process is about finding that balance between getting the essays and the applications done and all of the other commitments that you have, whether that's school or in the summer, part-time jobs, internships, occasionally finding time to sleep, spend time with your friends. There's other really important and valuable things. So in many cases, that least worst time is the summer after junior year. But we chose take full advantage on this slide for a reason. If you're going to take full advantage of the summer after your junior year, in some ways, especially if you're thinking of working with us, in many ways, now is a great time to get started, because it gives us time to get to know the student, to build that relationship with them, start kicking around and brainstorming ideas and laying a solid foundation for the summer, so we truly can take full advantage of the full duration of the summer and not simply start in June. And the goal for that is that ideally most of the essay and application work will be done by the time senior year starts. Junior year is always rough on students. There's a lot of courses, there's a lot of extracurriculars. Senior year, in many ways, doesn't let up in the intensity. You do not want to start your senior year of high school with having 10 essays and your applications hanging over your head. You want to get as much of that done as possible so that you can enjoy being a senior, rule the school, sort of sit back and exhale when all of your friends are stressing about the things that they have to write because you got this done ahead of time. And this is something that you want to dedicate time to. It's sort of like running a marathon. If you're in the last chunk of the marathon, we all know you see the finish line, and that is the point where you pick up the pace and start to sprint, because you did not put in all of this work to sort of walk over the finish line at the end and lose that, great personal record time. I don't know. I'm not a runner, but the essays and applications are one of the moments where you do still want to truly focus in and spend the time that you need. What those essays are going to be, first and foremost, the personal statement. When we say the personal statement, this is going to be the 650-word Common App essay, or if you're using the Coalition app, this will be around 500 to 550 words. It's the essay that goes to every college. It's the chance for you to really show who you are as a person, a roommate, a lab partner, what makes you tick as a human being besides the list of numbers that they're going to get from your school transcript, from, you know, the test scores coming from College Board or ACT. But you're also going to be writing for many schools things called supplement essays. These are essays that are specific to a school. Schools can ask you to write additional essays. Some ask you to write none. Some ask you to write 5. I'm looking at you, Yale. And these are frequently, it will be why college or why your major. Why do you want to study this specific thing? And why do you want to study it here? But you also may be asked about a community that you belong to. Michigan, for instance, has both a why college and a community essay, so that they can see sort of who you are as a person, but also how you move through the world and how you interact with the people around you. And many will also ask you to elaborate on an activity that you participate in. They understand extracurriculars are a way that a lot of students spend their time and want to get a chance to get to know you a little bit better in that regard. But let's talk about the personal statement. This is the one that gets sent to every school. So in some ways, it is the most important. And it is the most personal. When we work with students, this is often the essay that takes the most time, because it is, in some ways, a student putting a little piece of their soul on a piece of paper and shipping it out to an admissions officer. So 650 words on the Common App, 500 to 550 on the Coalition. It doesn't sound like a lot of space, but we can fit a lot in there, especially when we take the time to brainstorm properly. And when you do that, when we work with our students, the first thing that we do is we send them a blank document titled, "What do we need to know about you?"
Yeah.
At that point, it is a free-for-all. You're going to write everything down. Hobbies, rituals, traditions, of course, your resume and your activities, but also that story about the weird thing that happened in the boat in the summer of your 10th grade. This is one of these moments where we ask students to take their laptop down to dinner, get their parents to go, everyone is going to talk about how wonderful I am. Ask your friends, and focus on experiences and stories rather than adjectives. A lot of people can say that they are curious or love nature. We're looking for the story about the time when you yelled so loudly when you saw a peregrine falcon almost made your mom have a car accident. And why are these things important to you? Because that kind of passion and interest is what's going to show through in your essays.
And I actually want to add, can I add one thing, Alyssa? I just want to throw the college essay guy under the bus real quick on background.
Go
and
for
just
it.
This. Well, because we're big believers here. Like, we do the free webinars. Like, I want people to have information that they can use and access. But the idea of adjectives, like the college essay guy, his essay prompts, his personal statement prompts are all based in values. So the way that Alyssa said, like, you can't just say, this is an essay about curiosity. If you start from or this is an essay about my value is compassion. If you start from the outside in, you're 1,000 times more likely to have canned examples that don't feel as authentic as starting from the inside out. Well, I scream, my mom almost crashed the car. I guess that means I'm passionate. Where else do I bring that enthusiasm, right? Like, because there are so many students who see that. And in fact, a lot of English teachers use the college essay guy. And again, as an English teacher, I'm not throwing y'all under the bus either. I just want to reiterate, like, you can't start with the story and then extrapolate from that. Don't feel like you have to have something huge and impressive to say and then prove it. It's really start from within. You don't have to climb Mount Everest or cure cancer to write an amazing essay. The more insightful and detailed and personal you are, that's the good personal statement essay. Okay, that's and now off the mountaintop. I'm done, but just had to say.
You could cure cancer and write a very bad essay about it if
Absolutely,
it doesn't tell me
absolutely.
anything about who you
Who
are.
you are. Absolutely.
So those stories are going to come from two places. They're of course going to come from your resume, your activity, your jobs, your internships, the skills you have, but often we encourage students to think about those. We call them your eulogy experience. No one in a eulogy is ever going to go, so-and-so worked for 25 years at a corporation, and this is what we remember about them. They're going to talk about their passions, their hobbies, experiences they had that were meaningful, traditions that they shared with others. So when you sit down to brainstorm, sure, put your resume stuff down, but even in that moment, we're often going to be looking for the small detail in, in your internship, rather than just writing, I interned here in the summer, because that's so much more indicative of who you are as a person. That being said, we already talked about you can write a bad essay about curing cancer. What does make a bad essay? Something's not personal. If you write your curing cancer essay and it is just about gene therapy and not about you, but it's also going to be cliched topics. We say this not because sports or your camp are not meaningful in many ways, but in a sense because they are meaningful to so many different students. It is often difficult to create an essay that is going to stand out above the 1,500 other sports or camp essays that an admissions officer is going to read. We have a former admissions officer on our staff, and when he introduces himself to people, he often goes, and I've read hundreds and thousands of essays, and I'm glad to bring that experience to you. And every time he says that, I just see the smallest amount of eye twitch of just like, after having spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours reading essays about sports and camp. That being said, sometimes you can take one of those topics and have it truly shine. And that is the joy of the brainstorming process, is being able to dig in and find the small detail in the, in the camp, where it is about a specific method of building a campfire and how that specific method teaches you something about being methodical or the value of small gestures. So it's not just, I went to camp and spent 7 weeks away from my parents and it made me grow up and this was very important. The other thing we're going to stay away from is controversial topics or diary entries in some way. Once again, that is not to say that you can't write about these topics, but these are still things that are meant to show who you are in the best light possible. And often when you start to write about topics like divorce or politics or religion or toxic friend groups or sibling rivalries, the focus leaves you and starts being about the sibling, the toxic friends, the political situation, or whatever it is. So as much as possible, it's a personal statement. It needs to be personal to you. And those of you following along at home have just heard me go over and over again, you shouldn't write about this, but actually you could. Because in many ways, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. There are good essays about athletics, about sports, about camp, but they need to be distinctly personal. And one of the ways we do this is I'm sure you all have seen the Common App released its 7 prompts for the year. Nothing has changed from last year. We often tell students to not focus on the prompts. As soon as you start writing to a prompt, you have put yourself in a box about, I need to write about a time when I was grateful, and not, I need to tell a story that is meaningful about myself. And that is truly all admissions officers are looking for. Admissions officers are people. They want to get to know other people so that they can then admit them. You don't need something terrible to have happened to you. In fact, there's the diary entry issue with terrible things that have happened to you. You just need to be yourself and trust that you and what you have to bring to the table is going to be enough, because it is.
And if I could just jump in on this slide really quickly, this bullet point about, we hear it all the time. What if nothing that bad happened to me? Or like, well, I'm just normal. What do I write about? One example I like to give here, my younger sister was a state champion track and field athlete. And yeah, if you're connecting the dots from my earlier story, you realize that, yes, my little sister showed me up in a lot of areas. But she did not write her college essay about being a state champion track and field athlete. And, it already said other places in her application in the awards section, right, that she was a varsity athlete for 4 years and that she was a state champion. She doesn't need to brag about that in her essay. She wrote about taking care of 7 barn cats because her brothers all didn't like cats. So just to illustrate the point, even if there is something outstanding about you, that doesn't mean that's what you should write about. So this idea that, oh, well, I'm just a normal kid, or my son is just a normal kid, what does he write about? Everyone has something that is personal and unique to them that they can be focusing on.
Wait, were you one of the brothers that didn't like cats?
I didn't. Yeah, I'm reformed. Don't worry.
He's since
Okay, good. I was about to go. I don't know if we can be friends anymore, Jim. All right, so our why college essays. This is one of the most common essays that students will encounter beyond the personal statement. And in some ways, they become the bane of some of our students' existence, because you may only have to write one personal statement. You may have to write 10 why college essays. So first we come with good news. It's not exactly 10 why college essays. You can reuse and repurpose. Once you have a moment to think about why you want to study, what you want to study. Jim, can we actually go one slide back? You're going to realize that these schools' why college essays actually look very similar. And we have Michigan and Penn's here on our slide, because you can see, let's take biology and curing cancer. This seems to be the theme of the night. If you want to write about how interesting you find gene therapy and the research project you did in your biology class that helped you sort of understand and engage with this, and that's why you want to study biology. In many ways, you're going to say that when you apply to Michigan with the top prompt, or when you apply to the University of Pennsylvania with the bottom prompt. So that part, if you're working with us, we spend a lot of time helping you craft that. We have an entire academic mission statement worksheet. And then we also help you research those specific elements with each school, because you're going to reference different professors, different classes, different possible research experiences when you go to apply to these different schools. So you can reuse and repurpose, but at the same time, you're going to do the research, so each one is going to be interesting. As far as these essays go, one of the most common concerns we have for students is it's not the student who for example, wants to study gene therapy and cure cancer and wants to study bio. In that case, we can go, you're going to bring in your past experiences with this topic. You're going to think about meaningful class moments and think about the goals that you have. It's often the students who go, I don't know what I want to study. And that's fine. It is okay to be undecided. But at the same time, there's a difference between the kind of undecided that just sort of sits back and goes, eh, and the kind of undecided that wants to do everything. We had a student a couple of years back who, in talking about majors, finally told us, it's not that I'm undecided, it's that I'm multi-decided and I want to do all of the things. Show that intellectual passion. It is all right to be undecided, but you have to be interested and interesting. Tell us about how you love Spanish literature, but you also love chemistry, and you're not sure if there is a way to bridge that yet, but you're looking forward to figuring that out for the next 4 years on a college campus. The most important part is to not have no ideas, but to have a plethora of them. And that's something that shows up with the fine arts too. So of course, if you are applying to art, film, or architecture, you may need a portfolio. One of the developments in our company that we're most excited about is we are working with a consultant portfolio, a portfolio consultant words. That's something that we're excited to be able to offer, but it's also something worthwhile to consider that if you aren't applying specifically to a program that requires a portfolio, but you have materials, you may still want to consider submitting one. We had a student this past year who ultimately was applying to STEM programs, but also submitted a portfolio of beautiful naturalistic watercolors and a personal statement that tied all of her interests together, her painting, her interest in STEM, into this really beautiful description of the things that she was passionate about. And that's something where it can give another dimension or perspective, even if you aren't necessarily going, oh, I'm going to go to a college where I'm going to study fine art.
Thank you, Alyssa. So I think really the last piece is just, Alyssa kind of covered all the different kinds of essays. The last part I'll sort of add is that we work with students from the very, 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 very beginning stages. In fact, now is the time, this is the dream time that we're hoping to get students started, because even though we know junior years, a lot of students are like, it's junior year, it's too crazy, I don't have time, which we hear you. I absolutely understand that. But that said, if we start with students now, we can have the chance to get to know each other and have those conversations. Like Alyssa said earlier, picking your personal statement topic it's kind of the name of the game when it comes to essays. And it's a big piece of what we call packaging. I tell my students, you're a person, not a Twinkie, but there's an element of like, how do we package you and show you to the school in a way that they see all the facets of the diamond that is you, right? So one of those things is if you're a business student applying to a school like Michigan or Indiana or any of the big business schools, you're going to have a bunch of business essays, like Alyssa was saying, right? You might be tempted to write your personal statement about the business you started during the pandemic. We would advise against that, right? We'd say, okay, we know you're going to talk about it in all these other places. Let's focus on a different part of you, right? So that's what we're doing now, is we're getting to know our students. We're having the kind of fun conversations about what could your personal statement be? If that's this, what would your activity essay be? We're working on common apps. We're just kind of doing all the build up kind of prep work into getting ready to have students be able to jump into the summer ready to draft. So when we work with students, we work in pairs. We work on unlimited drafts. I don't care if it takes you 3 drafts or 300 to perfect the personal statement. We'll keep going till you love it and we love it and we think the school will love it. That's our standard, and that's something I'm really proud of. We're always happy to go back and revisit, and we're very protective of students' voice. Like, we want to make sure that you have a piece at the end of the day that you feel like truly represents you. And also, it's just kind of a beautiful transition moment in your life to kind of say, these are 650 words I'm going to say about myself in this giant moment as I take this next leap. So that's kind of the fun part. So we do unlimited drafts. Support, we're around, man. We have built-in meetings throughout the process, but you can always text us or email us and say, Alyssa, what the heck were you asking me in that Google Doc comment? Can you jump on Zoom for 15 minutes? And we will do that. So we really, it's not like structured tutoring time. It's more flexible than that. Of course, students, the only rough kind of bad news is we won't write the essays for you. Sorry, not sorry. You're gonna have to write them yourself, but we will be there every step of the way. I know you don't want us to. Also, you don't want like a 36-year-old woman writing your essay. It's not going to sound like you, right? Admissions officers will see right through that. But we're here to push you and to help you be insightful and to ask you for the details and to help you craft the shape of the story. And then lastly, just to make sure it fits 650 words, because getting your life story onto a page and a half is rough. So that's where we come in. So we'll protect you, we'll protect your voice. We'll make sure you stay on deadline. And really, once we work with students, we stick with them all the way to the end of the process. So even if once all your essays are done and your applications are submitted, we help with wait lists. If you're waitlisted or deferred, we'll help you write a follow-up letter of interest, any of that kind of stuff. So we're here to celebrate the wins with you and then shake our fists at the sky if anybody should dare to reject you. That's really how we work. And we form, I think what separates us is we actually end up forming some great relationships with our students and families. So that's my soft pitch. But Jim, I will leave it to you to wrap up. And also, please, if you have questions, y'all, please drop them in the chat and we can tackle them for you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. So we'll open it up to Q&A. We have a few to answer now. Please drop more in. We'll be able to stay until about 8:30 if we're still getting questions up to that point. If you have any questions that are more particular to your student's situation and wouldn't be kind of generalized to the whole audience or not something you're comfortable asking in front of an audience, please just email us this email address. One of the three of us will be able to get back to you. All right. So we had a question come in about letters of recommendation. What if a core subject teacher who had my child twice doesn't want to write the letter? And that subject is related to the field he wants to go in.
Can I take this one, Jim?
Sure.
Don't do it. Don't get a letter from that person. I mean, and I don't mean that I'm just saying you want someone who is enthused. You don't want a hard sell. And so that's unfortunate. I'm going to go ahead and assume that that person has some kind of issue there. If your student has had, experience with them and they're not willing, boo to them. But don't do it. I would say find an ancillary, find a connective one. If it's a math teacher, find a science teacher. If it's a history teacher, find an English teacher. Like find the next click over. It is not worth trying to go to the mat with somebody who's not willing to write a great letter. It's going to have that damning with faint praise problem. Make sure if somebody has something to say about you, they can say it unreservedly. You don't want a situation where somebody feels resentful of writing a letter. So even though that's annoying, and I'm sorry for your student, that is no fun, go with another teacher.
I'll add one small point to that, which is assuming this is a current year teacher, there are 3 months left to repair a relationship. And if a student's able to turn a corner and show maturity and fix a relationship with a teacher to the point where it would substantially change the content of that letter, that might be worth pursuing. Now, doing that just for the letter of recommendation might not be the best idea, but it could be a lesson in maturity and learning to get along with people that you butt heads with, which is, a valuable skill throughout life. So that's option number 3, I guess. All right, next question. What is the max number of SAT or ACT tests a student should take? Okay. This is a totally context-dependent question. I cannot answer this in a vacuum. I mean, for some of our students, if you get a perfect score the first time, the answer is 1. That is an extreme example. Most of our students will end up testing 2 or 3 times, multiple times, because super scoring is such a common policy. Super scoring is when a college will accept scores from multiple test dates. They'll take the highest individual section scores across those multiple test dates and recombine them into an overall score. So super scoring does reward students who take the test more than once. For that reason, most of our students will test more than once. That said, The point of diminishing returns for a student is highly individual. I do think, more than 3, you really need a good reason to test again. We've worked with student athletes whose coaches told them, just keep taking the SAT every time until your last try, because I need to get my team's average higher. If you're an athletic recruit and your college coach tells you to do something, just do it. So for that student, it was every time the college coach told you to take it is when you should take it. Another example where it can make sense to take the test a lot of times would be if you're applying to a college that has a numerically defined scholarship tier. This is very common for some of the southern state schools where, if you have this GPA and this SAT or ACT score, you get this many $1,000s a year. Well, in a situation like that, continuing to retest to try to get another couple $1,000s a year can sometimes be worth it. But this is totally a context dependent decision. For some students, it's 1. For most students, it's 2 or 3. It can make sense to take it more than that. All right. What is our recommendation for requesting interviews with schools?
I think that this is an interesting question. So interviews, from what I understand, and this is the kind of thing we ask colleagues in the field, right? We already mentioned we have a colleague who's a former admissions office, and we're always trying to gauge how much does this make an impact? And so the word, and please, Jim, if you have anything to add, jump in, but the kind of word of mouth and kind of understanding of it I have is this: an interview it can be a slight add. It is most of the time neutral, and it can be, if you spectacularly bomb your interview, it can be a negative. So I guess the short version is, in some cases, if there's something very particular about you that doesn't come across on your essay or application or recommendations, if you happen to be wonderfully comfortable or impressive or interesting, or if something, it kind of depends on the recommender, right? Oftentimes interviews are with alumni. And, essentially most of the time they're going to write smart kid, very polite, loved it. And the admissions officers will go, okay, great, and move on, right? It would take something very big, either good or bad, for the interview to make a huge impact. And I think you are, I'm leery of it a little bit, in the sense of I'd be more afraid of a bad outcome than a good. Now, if a school has built in interviews as part of their process, that's common. And again, same deal. Even if they ask you for an interview rather than you ask them, it's still going to have the same, not so much weight, unless it's amazing or terrible. That said, we do offer interview prep. It's one of my favorite. We don't talk about it a lot because it comes up at the end of the process, and a lot of the talking that we do is kind of pre and getting ready for the process. But we do have an interview prep option, and I just think it's one of my favorite things we do, because one, it's such a transferable skill. Thinking about, we have a workbook that we have you fill out. It takes a few hours. We kind of find your key stories. Then you can have this option to meet with our co-founder, Karan Shah. And I think the practice of having to sell yourself, getting direct feedback on do you say all the time? Are you holding your hands in your face? Are you being professional? Do you have a good way to pivot your stories into any question that gets asked? I think that's an invaluable skill. So I'm a big believer in interview prep, because I think if you can go in there and kill it, it can only help. Plus, there's a very good chance you're going to be interviewing for things the rest of your life. And it's kind of an amazing opportunity to get a leg up on that. But the short answer to the question is, interviews are sort of neutral unless they're really amazing or really bad, in which case they can make an impact. Would you agree with that, Jim?
Yeah, and the final kind of point I'll add to that is that it is a way to demonstrate interest, in a sense. So colleges that track demonstrated interest, it might matter more.
Right.
I know we haven't talked much about that tonight, but it's another thing to consider. All right, another question. Can you clarify the number of letters of recommendation my child should get? Is it 2 teachers plus the school counselor, or 1 teacher plus the school counselor?
So in a sense, the short answer to this is no, we can't clarify, because it is going to vary by school. For instance, Penn State does not require or look at letters of recommendation unless they are specifically requesting them. Georgetown only asks for 1. So that's something that is going to vary from school to school. Asking two teachers and a counselor is usually a good general guideline because that will allow you to cover the range of requests that schools may make. But ultimately, exactly what the school asks for is going to vary.
Right. And I would say most common is going to be two teachers and a counselor, or one teacher and a counselor, or zero. All right. So another question about retaking the SAT and ACT, which I believe I covered in my last answer. So then final question here, would you post contact information for the portfolio consultant? So it's on the screen here. If you email info@myivexperience.com, we'll be able to get you set up with a portfolio consulting session. If you have questions about the service, you can call that number or contact the email, and we'll be able to address any of that and get you set up. All right. So it looks like we've covered all of the questions. Thank you all again so much for attending. This was really fun. If you have any other specific questions, like I said, our contact information is here. Best of luck to you parents and to you students with the rest of junior year, and we hope to hear from you soon. Take care, everybody.